Hello everyone, my name is Eamon. I'm the podcast lead at Liverpool Global Relief. Today I'm joined by ocean science student at the University of Liverpool, Ryan. Ryan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Ryan. I am a third year ocean scientist and I'm here today to predominantly talk about my time volunteering in Ukraine in the humanitarian sector over there. Yeah.
So, Ryan, why did you decide to volunteer in Ukraine?
Yeah, so I just want to separate my first trip to Ukraine from the first time I was volunteering. They're actually two separate things. So I decided to go to Ukraine at the start of 2023, so just before the first anniversary of the full-scale invasion. And basically, I was looking for, this is going to be a bit different tone to the rest of this maybe, but basically I wanted to have some kind of unique and interesting experience. And as a student with limited money, I'm limited to go to Europe. And of course, I'm quite politically motivated. I follow everything in the news. So I found out that I could just go to Kyiv. So I went to Poland and I hopped on a train and I had a few days in the capital of Kyiv at the start of 2023. And I had my adventure. I thought, wow, what a great place. I really liked my time there. I met some interesting people. So after just a few days there, I decided that I wanted to do more.
Yeah.
Hence why a year later I went volunteering there for the first time, and I've been back a few times since for the same thing.
Yeah. So what exactly did you do there whilst you were in Ukraine on the humanitarian basis?
Yeah, so I volunteered basically in two different parts of the humanitarian sector. So I started out in Lviv. This is a city in the west of Ukraine. It's the westernmost major city actually. It's like an hour from the border with Poland. So Lviv is where I started, and there what I was doing was working with mostly displaced kids and kids of soldiers at a camp helping to teach English.
Yeah.
And this is broadly teaching, but also it's more about, remember we have displaced kids, so we're looking to create a nice environment for these children. So when I say displaced, a lot of these kids, actually mostly they come from Donbass, so the two easternmost provinces of Ukraine. They, recently have fled their homes, and a number of them even come from towns and cities that don't really exist anymore.
Yeah.
And the ones that still do, the cities that still do exist, are, of course, hugely changed by occupation or just by being near the fronts.
Yeah.
So that's how I started out in Lviv, helping to teach English and create a nice environment for these kids of the war. And also did a little bit of stuff there with veterans of the war, doing a similar thing where we're just doing English clubs with them, so just having speaking sessions. There's a big, there's a few, but there's a big rehabilitation centre in Lviv called the Unbroken Centre, and that's where I did some stuff in like summer of 2024 and winter of 2024/early 2025, and we're basically just having chats. They appreciate having people come in from abroad to talk to them, and English is useful and just interesting for them to do. It's kind of a part of the rehabilitation process.
Yeah.
There you deal with all sorts. Some of the soldiers, it's more minor wounds, but they also deal with some of the heavy stuff, people with life-changing injuries. So we're just providing something nice for them, basically, as much as we can.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on Putin saying that NATO expansion into Ukraine has been an imperially motivated action, and Russia's only acting in self-defense?
So, there's a lot to unpack here, of course.
Yeah.
So a good starting point is the full-scale Russian invasion. So 2022, the pretext that this is about NATO expansion, is completely untrue. So one of the key rules for a country joining NATO is they must have territorial integrity, so they must control their borders fully. So in the case of Ukraine, of course, since 2014, Russia have occupied and annexed Crimea, and they've occupied significant parts of the Donbass, so Ukraine's easternmost regions of Luhansk and Donetsk. So just on that alone, Ukraine is ineligible to join NATO. It's not possible. Furthermore, I'd like to say, since the start of the war, Finland and Sweden have both joined NATO. Now, if this was really about NATO, you would not have seen this, where Russia used to have quite a large force near the Finnish border before they were even in NATO, and more recently they have joined, and you can see now Russia have almost no troops on the Finnish border.
Yeah.
That is to say, they're not really worried about NATO. And also in the context of Ukraine is, before 2014, NATO the views Ukrainians had on NATO were actually not all that positive. In general, it was like less than 50% support for Ukraine joining NATO. Some people thought about joining the EU, but again, it was kind of around 50% margin. So before the first acts of proper Russian imperialism and aggression against Ukraine, people weren't really very interested in joining NATO. So after 2014, when part of the country was occupied, views towards NATO did change a little bit. So now, between 2014 and 2022, more than half of Ukrainians wanted to join NATO, but it still wasn't a drastic majority or anything. Anyway, it's only been since the start of the full-scale war, since 2022, that now 80-90% plus of Ukrainians want to join NATO, and it's because, well, they've been invaded twice. So the Kremlin lines on this aren't quite true. I'd also like to say that Russia's invasion of Ukraine doesn't exist just on its own, because there is a broader picture here, of course. And one key broader picture is this, how do I put it? The key ideology behind what Russia are doing here is the fact that they're ultra-nationalists. The Kremlin are expansionist, and they have this view of cultural superiority and dominion over their neighbors. So one of the prevailing ideologies right now in the Kremlin is leading to this idea of Novorussia, which is New Russia in Russian. So the idea of New Russia is they want to reoccupy a lot of areas that used to be Russian, former Russian Empire and former Soviet territories. So once again, broader picture, didn't start in Ukraine. So since the fall of the Soviet Union, we can see that Russia have done some kind of aggressive or expansive war every 5 to 10 years or so. So right after the Soviet Union fell, they occupied part of Moldova, Transnistria. They occupied and destroyed Chechnya, invaded Georgia, and have invaded Ukraine twice. So once again, the Kremlin is kind of characterized by these aggressive expansions every 5 or 10 years, roughly, and Ukraine are just the latest victim of this expansive ideology that the Kremlin have, where they want dominion, they want control over territories that are independent, but the Kremlin views them, they want possession of them, they view them as theirs.
Yeah. So essentially, what you claim is that, this idea that Russia is simply defending itself, acting in self-defense, is merely an excuse to expand into further territories and to build itself back up again. Essentially, that is the idea, yeah. So, alongside, the impact that it's had in Europe, there is a lot of commentary by political analysts on, Russia's role in the wider world. So there's a lot of talk about the BRICS countries. Are you familiar with that term? Yeah. So Brazil, Russia, what was the I again?
India,
China, and South Africa.
Yeah.
So essentially, what the BRICS countries are, just for the viewers to understand, is it's a sort of new alliance that is slowly being formed to essentially depower the American world order that we have seen for the past 100 or so years. The goal is to essentially create a currency that is backed by gold. How do you view this in the long term? Do you believe that is a sustainable sort of approach that will continue and be a genuine force for in geopolitics in the future?
This isn't a military alliance, but it is an attempt to reorganize world trade. As far as world reserve currency goes, that's really interesting, because we can see that the dollar is currently still the world reserve currency, but there are little signs here showing that is maybe starting to crack, and of course that does raise the question of, well, what else could be the world reserve currency? So as far as a BRICS currency goes, it's really hard to see that. It's unlikely. You see, even in Europe, I love Europe. The euro has been more of a mixed bag, though, let's say. So because the strengths of these economies are so different, even more different than we see with the euro, it's really hard to have a single unified currency. So for instance, EU's been great for so many countries in Europe, but let's take the example of Greece, where actually having the euro there's been a lot of upsides and downsides. There's a lot of ways where it has actually weakened their economy, and it might be that cost benefit means it's better, but it's kind of up in the air almost. When it comes to the differences and the strengths of BRICS economies, that's even larger than the difference between European economies who, introduced them the euro took ages. It wasn't an easy task. So introducing a BRICS currency and having that be the world reserve is a really tall order, especially when you consider that not all of these countries are so aligned. Like, once again, they do want trade, but there's not a unified front between making a world reserve currency, and it's also important to say it's not necessarily in all of these countries' long-term interest, which is why that they might not be in for this. For instance, a lot of part of this BRICS narrative is that maybe China, maybe they should have the world reserve currency, and on the face of it, it's definitely an interesting argument because, of course, China, second largest economy in the world, they probably will be the largest economy in the world fairly soon, right? And of course, there is weakening resolve in the dollar because of all sorts of terrible things in the US right now that I don't know, maybe we'll get onto later, but stuff's bad there.
Yeah.
But the reason why I say this isn't necessarily an interest for them is China don't actually want to have the world reserve currency. They have an export-based economy, and it can lead to certain weaknesses to have that. So it's hard to see BRICS having a unified idea or a unified front for world reserve currency. They all continue to trade, but it's not quite a power or alliance bloc. It definitely does put into question, a US homogeny, as you said, but it's hard to see there being a world reserve currency via BRICS. It's just very difficult to implement, and there's a lack of unification, let's say, in BRICS countries for all this.
Yeah, it's a big question, but I'm going to get your views on it regardless. Do you believe that the world would be better off if we lived in a multipolar world rather than the supposed unipolar world that we live in?
Yeah, so it depends. There's different ways a multipolar world could look. It depends who you want to rehabilitate. So I believe when it comes to rehabilitation, I think by this point Russia are out of the question. Maybe soon we can walk through, just which articles of the UN Genocide Convention they're breaking in Ukraine, almost daily.
Yeah.
So for Russia, with the current regime, with the current ideology that they have, rehabilitation, not possible. They've done too much, too many bridges broken, out of the question.
But then again, they argue
but it's not just
self-defense.
Russia.
They argue self-defense against America and NATO, so
Yeah, they
from
can
their
argue.
point of view, apparently.
They can argue self-defense, but if you're committing genocide, I don't think that falls under the branch of self-defense.
Yeah.
So I don't think Russia are really in the question for that, and it's not just this ideological or moral argument. It's also that we're talking about a multipolar world. The thing is, the Russian economy is now a little bit bigger than Spain's. It's not quite
as powerful as they pretend they seem.
As powerful as they pretend they seem, or as powerful as they want to be.
Yeah.
From the Chinese side, it's pretty inevitable, of course, that they're gonna, their economy is nearly as big as the US once again. So it's looking like, they are the rising power, and historically, that normally indicates some kind of future conflict. So a multipolar world in that sense, we just have to see. We don't really know what, of course, Chinese homogeny would look like. So it's really hard to say, will that be a better world or not? It's too many unknowns. I would say, as somebody who is more on the side of self-determination, the US have done some bad things, of course, and they definitely violated that principle of self-determination on many times, of course. So that's bad, but once again, we don't know what the other thing is going to look like.
It may be worse.
It could be worse.
Yeah.
Okay, so given your humanitarian work on the ground in Ukraine, how do you view war now? How has that affected your view of war and geopolitics?
Yes, there definitely has been a change because of this. So now I'll explain more in a second, but now I've had some experiences that used to only exist on the news, and now I've had them in person. So I can say the most significant one was I was in Kyiv at the start of July in 2024. I think this was July 7th or 8th. And that was when the Russians hit the Okhmedit Kids Hospital. They hit a toxicology unit. So Okhmedit is Ukraine's largest pediatric hospital, or pediatric hospital. And start of July, there was one of the large missile attacks on Ukraine, and they hit cities all over the country, right? Not just Kyiv, and they hit all sorts of things. So in Kyiv, there were residences hit, and this kids' hospital. Yes, I was just in my hostel at the time, actually, and the hospital was maybe a mile away from my hostel. And of course, afterwards, there's like a general call that goes out for volunteers. So head down there. And just what volunteers were doing was clearing the rubble and passing around water, right? So that's what I went down there to do. Just for some more context, by the way, on that day. So I think I wrote some bits down because sort of thing I would rather bring up some statistics for. Yeah. So at the time, there were 600 people in the hospital, a few deaths, and about 300 wounded officially in that hospital. And there were more deaths and injuries in Ukraine that day. Kyiv was hit, Dnipro, like Kherson, I think, a bunch of cities. So it was one of the larger attacks. So to have this be face on was definitely has changed my views on things. That is to say, there is a certain disconnect, I think, when you see big, terrible event happening on the news, and as bad as it is, you feel a distance from it, of course, because you're reading a text or looking at a photo. So to have been there, it definitely does add a larger weight to when I see these sorts of things happening in Ukraine and elsewhere, of course. Not that it wasn't a big deal before when it would happen, but of course now it is just that much more significant, I would say. So that kind of experience, and also the experience that I've had with, of course, working with displaced people, that is definitely, again, some of their experiences is definitely, again, made this sort of thing be more tangible, right? Because once again, like reading something from home is different to being there in person, having experience with people and seeing some of these things face on.
We see things on our feed now instantly, and we hear about conflicts all over the world, and we're so desensitized to it, to the extent that, we'll be scrolling, we'll see that, another war has started, somewhere has been bombed, etc., etc. And it's almost as if we don't take into account fully the full picture and the amount of devastation that is actually that is behind it. And social media has sort of ruined our perception about it. So going on the ground and genuinely getting that first-hand experience has definitely changed you in a way, for you to take the impact of that more severely and internalize it at a deeper level.
Yeah, it's put more of like it's made this experience more tangible, because before, of course, it's a big deal when something bad happens in the world, but on some level it feels almost superficial, because once again, I'm reading a headline or I'm looking at a photo and it's different to being there. It makes it more tangible. Yeah.
So having volunteered in an area that is has been conflicted by war, has been affected by war, what sort of advice would you give to someone else who would be willing to volunteer as well in that sort of same sector, who would be willing to be doing humanitarian work as well?
Bottom line is, this work is really important. Of course, depending where you go, you have to follow the appropriate kind of risk assessments for you are. So me predominantly being in Lviv, Lviv's actually pretty safe. As far as Ukraine goes, it's very far west. Fortunately, Lviv is far enough west that while it does get targeted, the amount of deaths and injuries compared to other parts of Ukraine and other parts of the world has been relatively low. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Not that it's not significant, because of course, civilians have been killed in Lviv, and these are war crimes, and the people responsible hopefully will be held accountable. But the level of safety there is, you could do much worse, basically. And it's worth it for the sort of work that's being done. As far as other places, you just have to take the appropriate risk assessment for where you are. So if I was elsewhere in Ukraine, like I have been, Kyiv, Odessa, if I was further east, there'd be a different level of precaution I would take. So for instance, in And if I was further east, if I went to Kharkiv, which is Ukraine's second city, 2 million people live there, or used to before the war, so it's a massive city, of course.
Yeah.
If I was there, it's 20 kilometers from the Russian border, by the way, for context. That might be appropriate here.
Yeah.
If I was somewhere like that, of course, I would take different precautions. I'd be using the air raid shelters. I would be paying attention to all these kinds of things around me. But once again, I think if somebody's interested in going somewhere, just do your risk assessment, make sure you know what to expect where you are, and follow through on that for whatever's necessary in your particular situation.
Yeah. In terms of a sort of psychological approach, how should they prepare themselves mentally?
So once again, this is highly dependent on where you are. So you could walk around in Lviv, and if you were just put there, right, you might even think you're just in some random European city. It might be a while before you even see something that reminds you you're in a city or a country at war.
Yeah.
So on areas that are more on, let's call it the safer side, like Lviv, they're low stress. And the reason I say that is because when you walk around, you don't see such big evidence of being in a country at conflict. So even if you were nervous going in, I feel like this is the case for most people. Walk around, you see people, locals, relatively relaxed.
Yeah.
That kind of eases your stress, right? In other parts of the country, so I spent, a good amount of time in Kyiv and Odessa, which, aren't frontline cities, but they are... You see the war more in everyday life in these two cities, for instance. Once again, it's actually really cool to see the resilience of local people during, in Kyiv, these days in Kyiv, it's almost daily attacks. Loads of drones, sometimes missiles, and it's almost just a part of life now in a city like Kyiv.
Yeah.
Seeing the resilience of people to live through this for years is actually really inspiring. So that in itself is something to, you see people being resilient, you kind of gain resilience, right?
It inspires you, right?
It inspires you, It inspires you,
Especially because, you were born and raised in the UK, right?
Yeah.
We've lived in a safe country all of our life. We are a country that have initiated and partaken in wars throughout our lifetimes, but we've never experienced it firsthand, and we just see it on the news. And we don't take into account the genuine level of impact and severity that these conflicts have on people, women and children, men leaving their families at home. We don't take into account and genuinely just take a moment to reflect on that deeply. So I do believe it's really important to be volunteering, and it gives you a very, very unique perspective in life. Especially when talking about these kind of conflicts. But we have about 5 minutes left on the clock, so I wanted to dive deeper into your time as an ocean sciences student. Of course, there are a lot of environmental implications that come with studying that kind of course. There are a lot of environmental considerations that come with studying that course. And I wanted to get to know your thoughts on a couple of things. Especially things that have been spoken about quite a lot in British media recently, which I assume you're familiar with. There are a lot of water companies in the UK that have been scrutinised for essentially dumping sewage waste into our waters, and the regulators for these companies are accused of not being heavy enough on regulation. Just as an example, I'll bring up a statistic. So the Water Services Regulation Authority is called Ofwat, or Ofwat. It is the economic regulator for the water and sewage sectors in England and Wales. They fined Thames Water £104.5 million for persistent sewage discharges and failing to maintain its treatment works. There are many more examples from companies such as Southern Water, United Utilities, and more. So from your perspective, having studied, the ocean, and for you, I assume climate is a very, very important part of your studies and part of your political views. what do you urge politicians to do to implement change that will essentially not necessarily reverse this, because I assume it's not very easily reversed, but to essentially prevent this from continuing to happen, to preserve our waters, to preserve marine biodiversity, to preserve our climate, and make sure, we don't die in 10, 30 years because of how shit we're treating our waters and our environment.
Yeah, so of course this is, I mean, in terms of sewage, this is like a regulatory matter, and clearly inspectors and regulations haven't done their job in this particular case, because of course we've seen sewage out in our waters, which shouldn't happen. So that should be tougher enforcement and appropriate fines when companies, of course, break these rules and do produce sewage. So I'm not sure what the market cap of some of these companies are, but oftentimes when they get fined, for them, these fines aren't a big deal. They need to be proportional to actually disincentivize doing this sort of thing.
Yeah.
Of course, for broader climate, it is still regulation. It is important to say the UK is like, less than 1% of the world population, some similar amount, proportion of world emissions. This needs to be a worldwide thing, because even if the UK was net zero or produced negative carbon, if we extracted more than we released, for the broader climate picture, we're just a small country. We're only talking about a small proportion of the world.
Yeah.
So what we can do is, what we really need to do is more. We need to help the developing world become better on carbon, because, for instance, even fairly developed countries, even somewhere like China, right now they are building more coal power plants than exist in Europe.
Yeah.
Never mind the ones they already have. So this is really a worldwide front that we need, because
arguably we could do this by stopping the support of these companies, for example, who are very, very reckless and careless in their environmental duties. They hide behind ESG, but in reality, we find that they are actually, the worst actors in these areas, especially clothing companies, for example. We see the effects of this in the global south, and I'm sure our viewers are very well aware of that. But could you just give us a few examples, for example, of companies that are doing this in the global south that don't really give actual consideration to their ESG commitments?
Yeah, I mean, one thing to consider is these companies are enabled by the fact that we basically outsource a lot of our emissions and a lot of our pollution to them. So, the UK doesn't produce a whole lot of clothes. Most of our clothes come from parts of South Asia, really. So that is to say, we're outsourcing all of the pollution issues regarding to that sector to companies in those regions.
Yeah.
So they're just kind of exploiting a market that we have helped to create.
Yeah.
So, as much as these companies are polluting, we're in large part the enablers of that. Mm-hmm. So we need to think more about
who we are giving our money to,
sustainable production of these things, as opposed to kind of just buying cheap stuff and not thinking about the consequences of that.